Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please?
Please take your seats and fasten your seatbelts.
Flight crew, please prepare for takeoff.
Flight 229, you're clear for departure.
Thank you and enjoy your flight.
Hello, everyone. My name is Graham Mann, and this is the Business Aviation Podcast. On this podcast, we interview business aviation professionals with all sorts of backgrounds to learn about experiences, tips, and best practices to be successful. This episode's guest is Neil Capano. Neil is the founder of YonderWest Aero, a company helping small flight departments with aircraft scheduling solutions. He's also executive director of the Northern California Business Aviation Association and director of aircraft dispatch and station operations for Air Transport Business Development, or ATBD. He's a licensed dispatcher and has worked for a number of companies in the past, including Surf Air, Gama Aviation, Delta Airlines, and more. He's also a wine enthusiast and is currently developing his own wine label. In this episode, we talk about Neil's non-traditional career path, what he's learned from his experience in many different types of companies, including helping aviation startups, and how he made the leap from employee to founder of YonderWest. Make sure to check out the show notes for details and links from the conversation at leansystems.co/podcast. Please enjoy this episode with Neil Capano. Hey, Neil. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Graham. How are you? Thanks for having me.
I'm good. So I want to get right into things today. You've had a widely varied career, but I think you got your start in aviation with Independence Air. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. I started as a customer service and ramp agent for a small startup airline in my hometown of Manchester, New Hampshire.
And how'd you come to that job?
Well, I had made a couple changes in my life after a few things in my life had changed. So therefore, I had to change with them. And I actually applied to Southwest Airlines and Independence Air in the same afternoon. I was interviewed and hired at Independence, and I was already on the job in Manchester for 3 months before Southwest ever called me back. So clearly that decision was made for me.
I guess the highlights of being responsive on HR.
That is true.
Was there something that attracted you to the aviation industry initially, or not really?
Well, I think growing up, a lot of people have their preconceived notions on what they want to do with their lives. You know, you have the kids that want to play with dump trucks, and there are kids that want to play with trains, and there are kids that want to be pilots. And growing up, I really had a fascination for the bigger picture in aviation and how route structure worked and how to make money off of a hub for the airlines, and how revenue management would work. And as a result, I went to college for something completely unrelated, and I chose to kind of backtrack. And in retrospect, it was an excellent choice because I've been through a few career changes since then, which I'm sure we'll discuss. But I ultimately kept coming back to the fact that aviation is what I'm good at. So it stuck.
Yeah, you were studying American government and politics, right?
That's correct. I was born and raised in the epicenter of presidential elections in Manchester, New Hampshire. My parents were both civil servants and not very politically minded, but it was always something that fascinated me. The joke around the water cooler in New Hampshire is that Iowa picks corn, New Hampshire picks presidents.
That's pretty good. So Independence Air was an airline startup, as you mentioned. What were
Correct.
They were trying to establish an airline?
So the predecessor of Independence Air was called Atlantic Coast Airlines. They operated independently out of Washington, D.C. for a good 15, 20 years before they were acquired by United Airlines, and operated as a United feeder for a long time. There was a change in the way that the major airlines looked at their regional partners. And as a result, independents took that opportunity to spin themselves away from United and form a completely new brand, which ultimately lasted for a little over 2 years before its demise.
And did you stick with it until the end?
I did. I helped push back the last flight from Manchester, and 4 days later, they pushed back the last flight from Washington Dulles, and that was it.
Wow. And so after that experience, you went over to Delta. And
correct. I went over to a Delta connection carrier in Manchester as well. So just a couple of ticket counters down, and from there I went to Delta Mainline in Boston.
Right. And you held a few different positions in that role, I think. And I know you traveled a lot. What was that experience like?
Yeah, the main takeaway at Delta at the time was it was the middle of the financial crisis that was affecting commercial aviation particularly hard, consumer confidence, and ultimately led to a rash of consolidation within the airline industry. So I was a mainline Delta employee at the time that Delta acquired NorthWest Airlines based in Minneapolis. And as a result, and what frequently happens when airlines merge, they have two different workforces, they have different unions, they'll have different reservation systems, they'll have different types of airplanes. So part of my role in both Manchester and in San Jose was to travel to some of these Northwest only locations and help train the employees there to the new way of doing things, so to speak.
Right. I mean, I know you still travel quite a bit. You obviously enjoy it, but I know some people have mixed relationships with it.
That's true. And as we're speaking, I'm sitting in a office in Opelika, Florida that was graciously donated by my friends at JetX Flight Support. And I'm in the middle of a 2-week trip, which kind of brings about the question, why do you travel so much? And the reason I travel so much is that it actually does help my business to be on the road. But if I do 2 weeks of travel, that means I get to stay home for the next 2 weeks. And that's ultimately the reason that many people travel, is that, they can get things done on the road, but then their home time is their home time.
Right. All about balance. And I know at Delta, you also served as an environmental coordinator in that role. And as we'll probably talk about later, you have a passion for environmentally and ecology related things. But was it that role that initially sparked it, or was that an interest you held for a long time?
It wasn't. I think that growing up in New Hampshire led me to have a much greater appreciation for the outdoors and for ecology and for the flora and fauna that exist all across the country. California just so happens to be one of the more restrictive environmental locations and jurisdictions in the United States. And as such, as an airline, you were doing things like pumping jet fuel, and you had de-icing fluid, and you had maintenance locations, and you had all of these different parts of your business that all, they all had exhaust, they all had waste, they had all these different parts of the business that all had different environmental impacts. So part of my role, in addition to being a customer service agent in San Jose, was to help the business maintain the legality and the strict controls that California set out for it.
Right. No, it's certainly an important role, as we're beginning to see more and more emphasis on it too. So after Delta, well, we'll keep moving here because we've got a lot of ground to cover. You seem to have accomplished a lot. You, I think, moved to New Hampshire Helicopter, right, as a fuel vendor.
Yeah. So I left Delta, and there was really a sense of disappointment in that part of my life. I'd been with Delta and its regional carriers for almost 7 years. So it was a big part of my life when I was growing up. And I kind of came to the conclusion towards the end of my tenure that if I didn't do it, they could find somebody else to do it right away. And that was, to be honest, it was a little bit disheartening. It was disappointing. So I moved back to New Hampshire and got hired at a FBO called Port City Air that also has a helicopter business for maintenance as well. And I did international tech stops and customer service for base tenants and transient tenants and the large management companies and the large fractional ownership companies as well.
Right. And that kind of marked your shift from commercial to the private world. Was that a transition that you already knew about the private aviation world, or not really?
I didn't have a full understanding of what it meant at the time. And in retrospect, it would have behooved me to have a little bit of a better understanding. In the grand scheme of things, I didn't really prepare myself for what I was getting myself into. I knew that I wanted to get away from the commercial airline side of aviation, but I didn't really know what that next step would be.
Right. To some extent, I mean, to understand it, you got to be part of it at some point. So making the jump was probably the quickest way to do that.
Yes.
So from there, you went back out west, is that right? For developing some stuff for Surf Air? So
yeah, I think one reoccurring theme that you're going to find in this conversation is that I believe that career paths are nonlinear. I don't believe that the inherent Japanese style way of thinking where you have one job and you have that career for 45 years till you retire and get a gold watch is particularly valuable in this day and age. And the idea of a nonlinear career path is that there are ups and downs, that it is not a straight, there is not a straight line. There isn't a right or wrong way to do it, as long as you come to the conclusion at the end that you're happy with where you're going. And I'm going to be the first one to tell you, at Port City Air, they fired me. And at the end of the day, I'm okay with that now, because it really affected my way of thinking. And instead of just being a cog in somebody else's machine, I wanted to kind of go back and work on the education side of my life. And I was looking around, and a friend of mine made a recommendation to me to go and get my dispatcher certification. I didn't really know what that was, but I was curious. And it was maybe March, and it was snowy in New Hampshire. And I looked around, and I could have gone to Fort Lauderdale or Houston or Los Angeles to get this certification. And for whatever reason, I chose Denver, Colorado in the middle of another snowstorm. And the joke is, of course, now that I'm a Californian. So, the only time I want to see snow is if I go to Tahoe for the weekend. But lo and behold, they had a class that was starting, 2 days later. So I got on a plane and got myself to Denver and sat down in class for 6 weeks. And in that time, I was the only person in a group of 28 or 29 students. Some of them here from the United States, but a lot internationally, because Jeppesen does have an incredible reputation for delivering consistent training solutions for airlines and military personnel worldwide. And I went through the process at Jeppesen in Denver, and after 6 weeks, I walked out with a dispatch certification, knowing full well that I was never going to use it in commercial airline service. I was the only one of those 28 that had no interest in going to the airlines. I was using the skills that I picked up and the actual certification for a nice paperweight or something that looks very nice on a resume. But realistically, when it comes to holding Part 121 operational control, which is what that certification is setting people up for, that wasn't why I went at all.
Interesting. So there's a couple things in there I just want to dig into. I mean, being fired for most people is a pretty traumatic event. How, you said in hindsight, it turned out well and you're sort of happy it happened. At the time, though, I'm sure it was tough. What was kind of the thought process that went through your mind as you kind of dealt with that? And then, what I think going off to improve your education is a pretty positive end result. But was that what immediately came to mind, or what was your thought process through that time?
I think that I probably have a more realistic expectation of my own abilities. And by the end of my tenure at Port City Air, realistically, I was kind of burned out. And as much as I did like my job there, and as much as I am pig-headed and stubborn sometimes, my dismissal was devastating. You're right, and it's devastating to a lot of people. But it helped me find a better way to think about it and think about the interactions that I had and what's important and what are the roles in private aviation that I could go into. And it turned out that my good friend who recommended that I go and do a dispatch certification, her recommendation was completely spot on. And until she had mentioned it, I didn't know what a dispatcher was, what a dispatcher truly did. I, of course, did my research and found that out. But in hindsight, getting fired was really a good thing. It gave me the flexibility and the time to think about where my career was going, what I really wanted to do with it. And ultimately, I was thankful because I didn't have to make a 45-minute commute to Portsmouth every day too. That helped.
Yeah, indeed. No, I mean, I think that's a great way of looking at it. That event can often be devastating, but as you said, it's a good opportunity for reflection and considering where you're at and what's best. So sometimes it's almost a good excuse for a new beginning kind of thing.
And spoiler alert, Graham, there's going to be way more disappointment and introspection in the next couple of years.
Indeed. Yeah. It's, it's something people inevitably encounter, but is no doubt difficult the first time. So, okay. So you got your dispatch license. After that, you didn't really have an intention to use it. How did Surf Air come about?
Well, in my classic style, I went on a big trip, and I did actually take some airline interviews. With my dispatch certification in hand, I flew up to Anchorage and met with a couple airlines in Anchorage, and then immediately flew down to Los Angeles and met with Surf Air. And I was in Los Angeles for maybe 25 hours and then flew back to Boston to go home again. And they were looking to start up with their scheduled commuter service out of Los Angeles on a very quick basis. And I ended up getting a job offer on a Thursday. I flew out on a Saturday, and my first day was Monday. It happened incredibly quickly, and because that's the time frame that they were under as well. There was no lollygagging around. I needed to be on site to help them get started correctly. So that's what I did.
Right, and I mean, you mentioned you considered carefully what you wanted next after leaving New Hampshire. This fit the bill. I mean, for what reasons for you? What attracted you to this kind of company?
Well, it's easy for me to say it now, but I love California. And Surf Air, back 5-6 years ago now. They had a really ingenious business model. They were flying and operating aircraft that were incredibly good for what they were being used for, and they also desperately needed people for the start of their 135 operation. I was hired, and my first day was 9 days prior to the start of Part 135 flying in Los Angeles. And the fact of the matter is that it was exciting. It was a brand new aviation startup, something that hadn't been tried before in this context, to a completely different market segment. And there was a lot of excitement about it. There was a lot of people that were enthusiastic about it. And there was a lot of startup gumption. People wanted to talk about what it was and what it was going to be and all the potential. And I wanted to be part of that. So it was a really, really easy decision.
Yeah, I mean, speaking to you from California, I can certainly understand why people like it out here. And, having been in the startup world, I totally understand the excitement there is with building a company from that stage.
Graham, now you're just making me jealous. I love Miami, but damn, I want to be in California too.
If it makes you feel any better, it's not very warm here, but it is sort of sunny. So you were with Surf Air for a bit, and then you moved on to dispatcher and charter sales at ACI, right?
Yes.
So you actually got to use your qualifications.
Somewhat. I think that there was actually more technical dispatch being done at Surf Air than there was at ACI, but ACI had a very ingenious way of selling people on the idea of moving to rural California outside of San Luis Obispo. They would bring you up and show you the sights, and you looked around and kind of fell in love, and it didn't matter what the job offer was. The people that love the Central Coast of California fall in love, and the people that want to stay in Los Angeles and do the party and club scene, they look around and they don't understand it. And for me, I fell in love immediately. That's where I wanted to be. And, here it is, 5 years later, from that initial time that I spent up in San Luis Obispo. And now I'm a very happy resident of San Luis Obispo County. And I did leave for a while, and I finally came back this past year. I'm sure we'll get into that. But there's no place in America that I would rather call home than the Central Coast.
Yeah, it seems those kind of places always draw you back, eh? So at this point, you actually took a little break from the private aviation industry, right? And indulged one of your other interests?
I did. I took I call it my aviation hiatus. There was a little bit of disappointment, just like we've talked about disappointment in the past. And I ended up spending a lot of time up in the area around Paso Robles. I kept seeing the same people at the same wineries over and over again. And eventually I popped my head in to they're now good friends of mine, to a winery up on 46 West in Paso Robles. And the owner, Steve, looked up at me after seeing me a few times and knowing that I was kind of looking for a job. And he said, "Hey, what are you doing tomorrow?" And I said, "I don't know." He's like, "Do you want to come and work here?" So I said, "Okay, all right, let's do it." And that kind of led to that. And some of my best friends in California to this day are my wine friends in Paso Robles. And most of them all work in the industry, and they buy in the wine industry, I mean, and they do not understand what I do for a living because I try to explain it to them, and they're very, very smart, but me trying to explain the intricacies of my business in private aviation, their eyes just glaze over. They're not interesting. They're not interested in it at all. They want to talk about, who has a great new Syrah and who's planting Zinfandel out on that property that no one's heard about. And I think that that's fascinating, but they can't wrap their head around what I do sometimes. At some point I just bore them and they say, go away. We want to talk about something else.
Doesn't necessarily work both ways.
No.
So post wine aviation hiatus, and before what you're currently up to, you had a couple more positions, first being a flight support coordinator at SATCOM. What got you back into aviation?
Thankfully, my wine job and the family that runs the winery has always been very, very supportive of me. And they knew that the role that I was helping them out with was somewhat temporary. At the time, they still had daughters who were going through middle and high school, so they were focusing on getting the girls to soccer practice and getting the girls to go see colleges and all the stuff that is required for raising a family. And during that time, they could text me and say, hey, we don't need you this week. And I would text back, okay, I'm going to Yosemite. And I could just get in my car and go. And if I told them that I had a job interview somewhere, or if I needed to fly to Denver or go up to San Francisco, they would make it work. And they've always been incredibly supportive to this day, really. And they gave me the flexibility I needed to do what I needed to do. So that entire time, I was applying for jobs, and I was going the very traditional route. Put my resume on an online forum, or put it through an HR processor, and it would spit out a rejection, or I'd get a call and say, hey, we want to bring you in for an interview. And this was a repeating cycle. It happened probably 15 or 20 times that I went through this call from an internet connectivity company that was looking for a new flight coordinator. And I flew out there, and everything seemed to click at the time. And that was that.
So you managed to get over having to leave California for that one?
It was a tough sale. I'm not going to lie. And that said, I'm here in Florida right now, and I get it why I came here in the first place. But in retrospect, I would never do it again.
Fair enough. So you were there for a little while, and then your final role, sort of before your current ventures, was with Gama, right?
Yes. So I, after some more heartache, I moved up to Connecticut, which was important for my family. There were some health problems at the time, and there was kind of an unannounced saying down in Florida that if you didn't work at Satcom Direct, no one would ever hire you ever again. And the fact of the matter is that it took me 20 days to get a new job. It wasn't overtly difficult, considering my qualifications and my background. Which it's not anything to pat myself on the back for, but at this point in my career, it doesn't mean nothing either. So I did move up to I relocated up to Connecticut, and I ran Gama's Wheels Up and Managed operation for about 18 months while I was there, and for the first time in my career, I decided, after actually coming back to California on vacation, I decided that I wanted to do something else, and I wanted to start my own business. And in 2017, I made a commitment to myself for New Year's that I was going to do one trip a month for the entire month, or for the entire year of 2017. And halfway through that, I started working with an old colleague from Surf Air, and I started doing some consulting work on the side for a premium FBO in Southern California. So I was making a few business trips, but I did make a lot of personal trips as well. And I ended up at the end of 2017 at the end of 2017, I ended the year with 18 trips under my belt, getting on a plane and going somewhere. It was way more than I had expected. I think a lot of my colleagues thought I was crazy, but it's okay. They think I'm still crazy today. I can be an adult about that. So I did travel a lot. I did work really hard. And I was sitting at a friend's house in Morro Bay, California. And I was looking around, and it was actually where I used to live in Morro Bay. And there were 3 or 4 of us there, and we were all sitting down having dinner. We had a couple glasses of wine, and there was a fire going in the fire pit. And I looked around and I told them, I said, I'm moving back here. I don't know how I'm going to do that, but I'm going to do it. And one thing that you and your listeners should know about the Central Coast is that it is wild, and it is freeing, and it is incredibly difficult to live. Everything is far apart from one city to the next. It's really difficult to have to maintain a career there, working for somebody else. It's a beautiful place to live if you can do it, but it is not easy in any way, shape, or form. And as a result, part of those gears in the back of my head started turning once I decided that I was going to be coming back, was how do I do that? By that was probably June that I was sitting in Morro Bay. By August, I had a little semblance of an idea of what it would look like, of what starting a business would look like. I flew back out for a schedulers and dispatchers networking event in Palm Springs, California, that November, and soft launched my business with logos and a business card. By December, I was ready to pull the plug at Gama. And on January 1st, on New Year's Day of 2018, I gave 30 days notice and incorporated YonderWest Aero LLC as a limited liability corporation in California.
Okay, so a bunch of stuff in there. We'll circle back to what you're doing now with YonderWest, but the travel goal, I mean, aside, was it just the obvious appeal, of doing more traveling, or was there like a specific, event or appeal that triggered that sort of, I challenge myself to travel once a month?
No, I think that for the most part, it was just a matter of, for the first time in my career, and especially in that last 5 years, I truly had disposable income, and I did like to travel. So every place that I would go for a reason rather than just arbitrarily rolling the dice and getting on a plane. So I went back to California probably a half dozen times. I'd go down to Florida. I'd go to Colorado a few times. I did 10 days of sea kayaking off of Vancouver for my birthday in Canada. And more and more of my trips just ended up blurring the line between business and pleasure. And I realized towards the end of it that if I can make this happen on a consistent basis while I'm employed, there's no reason that I can't translate this to a more consistent travel schedule while running my own schedule.
Right. The other thing I wanted to talk about just before we got into, what you're up to now, because it probably relates to some of your early career experience, but I know you've talked about some of the challenges of, particularly for charter and brokers, of setting and managing expectations. You want to maybe just elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So I think that, and this is probably going to be a somewhat unpopular opinion amongst my peers and colleagues in private aviation. I believe that all customer service is expectations. And that's not the controversial part. The controversial part is that when it comes to setting those expectations and ultimately living up to them, most flight organizations do a really, really really poor job at it. And a lot of times when I say things like that, I'll get notes from people, or people say, "Oh, well, there's extenuating circumstances. Oh, we can't be blamed for this because it was really a different cause and effect." And the way I look at it is that it's irrelevant. What matters isn't necessarily how and what the expectations were, it's how those expectations were perceived. If you are an aircraft owner and you go to a management company, and not naming any names, any management company, it could be one in California, it could be one in Seattle, it could be one in New York City, it doesn't matter. The fact is that when something goes wrong, and that person, and normally it's a flight coordinator or a scheduler or whoever that company has employed to provide service to an aircraft owner, when there is a failure, the owner ultimately doesn't care. And they don't necessarily care that there's a mitigating circumstance. They don't care that a solution has been made and that it'll never happen again. Oh, well, we implemented a new process, we put together a new spreadsheet so that this didn't happen. And ultimately, the entire industry slips away from getting to the root cause of why it happened. If you're adding a bunch of additional workload in spreadsheets to make sure that somebody does their job right in a dispatch center or in a customer service situation, ultimately, those additional processes are taking away from the empathy and the expectations that employee has, so that cycle doesn't repeat itself. And when you put in more policies and procedures to make that solution, you're ultimately not creating a solution. You're creating a bureaucratic issue. And I think that that's a really important takeaway, is that ultimately we as humans, we as private aviation professionals, need to focus on being authentic and having some innovative solutions that don't necessarily require procedure, and being inclusive and understanding what an aircraft owner or a pilot or a mechanic is looking for and what those expectations are, so that you can ultimately meet and exceed them. So I think that on a philosophical sense, that we as an industry need to focus less on procedures. We already have a federal government regulating much of what we do, right? And we have business interests, whether we're working at an FBO or a charter company or as a pilot. We have these procedures and policies that are ingrained on a corporate level. But the more we start to nitpick and the more we start to add in procedures in a process that is already laden with procedures, we get away from that solutions-based philosophy, and it basically just becomes micromanaging. And I think at the end of the day, that's one of the reasons where I am now. And the buck stops with me at the table I'm sitting on, rather than going through 5 vice presidents and a couple trip support coordinators. So,
right. Procedures can be enabling sometimes, but others you have to figure out whether it's really necessary. So if I understand correctly, you have 3 main titles now. You mentioned your own consulting firm, YonderWest Aero. You're also involved with the Northern California Business Aviation Association, which we'll talk about in a minute as well. And Director of Aircraft Dispatch and Station Operations for Air Transport Business Development, ATBD. So
that's correct.
Does that cover everything?
I've been collecting titles recently.
So maybe we'll start with Air Transport Business Development, because I know YonderWest is your main focus, and we'll kind of get to that in a minute. Was this the sort of opportunity that you mentioned you were involved with someone who you'd worked with at Surf Air?
That's correct. it goes back to a little bit of the discussion about nonlinear career paths. I was sitting on one of my 18 trips at a Thai restaurant in Tampa, Florida, and I get a call from a friend of mine named Dave Hopkins, who originally acquired Surf Air's first 3 airplanes, ironically, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, about a mile down the road from where I was working at that time.
Small world.
And he called me and said, "Hey, I have an interesting proposition for you. There's an FBO that would like us to help them with marketing to aircraft operators. Would you be interested in coming and working with me on this project?" And it took me about 5 minutes to think about it. And I said, "Yeah, sure. That'd be kind of cool." And ATBD has a pedigreed 18-year history now, and the core of its business is helping startup airlines. When Dave and ATBD was contracted to Surf Air, they were doing exactly what their core business was, with a good 40 plus consultants worldwide, we help charter and commercial service worldwide. We have things going on in Southeast Asia and South America right now, in addition to work in North America. And our client list ranges from heavy hitters in the startup industry to airlines that have come and gone. And the fact of the matter is, when you look at the airline industry right now, it's not a pretty picture. Starting an airline is just about as on average profitable as starting up a mom and pop restaurant. It's just simply not a good investment. But we try to help startup airlines with a lot of kind of homegrown services and expertise that otherwise they'd be going to much larger consulting firms, which are priced much, much higher. And realistically, they're typically, if you go to HSBC or you go to Bain and you ask for help to start an airline, you'll have a bunch of MBAs put together a spreadsheet about how an airline is supposed to be financed and how it's supposed to be worked. And they will hand it to the client and say, "Best of luck, good luck with that." They don't have any inherent aviation knowledge to be able to start up an airline, whereas ATBD can step in with a director of maintenance and a director of operations and a chief pilot and a CFO and a CEO and a CMO. All these parts that you need really in a box, we can provide those and step in. I help Dave with his corporate aviation and airfield and FBO marketing. I generally don't get too involved with scheduled air service. It's just simply not my forte on the building blocks. But we do have a relatively robust FBO and air service development business that is ripe for expansion, especially on the West Coast of the United States.
Cool. So I know you mentioned when you were at Gama, you were doing a little bit of consulting work on the side. Was it this opportunity that ultimately led you to kind of pull the trigger and say, all right, I'm going to go back? Because I know there's probably a lot of people that listen to, the fact that you get to travel quite a bit and you're sort of your own boss in your own company and would like to explore something similar. But I know personally that moment of pulling the trigger to say, okay, I'm going to go do this other thing, or I'm going to try and start my own business. It's pretty intimidating and hard to figure out when you should do that, especially if you have a stable job. So was this kind of the trigger for that, or was it something else?
Well, I think that it wasn't until that phone call that I realized I could successfully have a side hustle, because at the time, that's really what it was. In present day, my company is bonded to ATBD, who has clients, and we make our projects work. But back then, it was kind of something fun to do on the side from Gama. and it wasn't competitive at all. It allowed me to kind of break out of the comfort zone. Ultimately, I'm not entirely sure that YonderWest would have had the success it's had if it wasn't for the opportunity to have that side role. And if I didn't have that, I'm breaking away from Gama would have been almost impossible, because I would have really started with no revenue. I would have started with no prospects, just simply me packing up a Toyota Tacoma and driving to California and have to start completely anew. At least with the work with ATBD and Dave, I was able to at least have that. It allowed me to have that little oomph to get me over that hill. Don't get me wrong. I was talking to my CPA this morning, and one thing that I told him was that the toughest part about running my business is actually running the business. Here it is. It's been over a year, and it is every day. It is exciting and freeing and bone-crushingly terrifying every single day.
Yeah, I think a lot of entrepreneurs would tell you the same, but no, I think that's really important is, a couple things, but, saying yes to those opportunities when they come up, knowing that, the worst that may happen is it doesn't work out and you've still got your job. And then also hedging a little bit, right? In that if it doesn't work out, you still have your job. So it's saying
absolutely.
yes to those opportunities, but also not necessarily dropping everything before you've sort of established yourself or figured out whether this might work.
Well, if you're gonna jump in the pool, you're gonna get wet. So you have to at least try it once, and who knows? The jury's still out. Maybe maybe this isn't a long-term solution, but for right now, at least I'm having fun with it.
Right. So before we move on from ATBD, I just wanted to ask. I mean, you've obviously been involved with various air related, whether they're airlines or other aviation startups, both early in your career and now with ATBD. Is there anything, sort of things they have in common that they need help with, or things that you've learned about aviation startups in general, aside from the fact that it's not a great investment and they're really hard?
Well, I think that there's a general complication with almost every aviation startup that I've been involved with. There is a side of the business that will typically think that its core business is operating airplanes. And typically that's normally the side that I'm on, because I am an operations guy. The sales aspect doesn't really appeal to me. I'm always going to, have a little bit of facial hair. I'm always going to be the guy wearing flip-flops in California. So getting all up in a suit and tie doesn't necessarily appeal to who I am as a human. But the other side of that equation is that there are people that normally within these organizations that believe that they are a platform, that they are a sales apparatus, that their business is not operating airplanes. It is finding users for that end process. And it's something that initially, and to a certain extent now, Surf Air still struggles with, and that a lot of startups are trying to figure out what exactly that middle ground is. Just as private aviation has multiple sides of the business, startups do as well. I think it's just a matter of how you want to internalize them. If you want to keep it within an organization, or if you want to have a true generational shift to determine what side of that coin is going to win. A great example was at Surf Air, especially. We had a employee at the main corporate office in Santa Monica, and his title was vice president of product. And one point he came to the hangar and he was talking about, hey, well, tell me what this means. What does out, off, on, in mean? Like, at what point do we consider someone late to check in? And he was like, well, I need to determine how the product relates to the end user, and the product in this case being a booking platform, and the end user being members who are passengers on board the airplane. And I looked at him with so much love, and I'm really saying that in all honesty, with so much love. And I told him that I don't understand what his job is, because our product isn't technology. Our product is pumping jet fuel into a Pilatus and flying it. That's what our product is. And I think that at that point, a lot of people didn't understand that. And I've seen that a number of times, where there's a disconnect between the technology side of the business and the operations side of the business. And I have been on the losing side of that fight a number of times, and it has caused heartache and tribulation. But I think you'll find that more and more frequently, that there are indirect air brokers that they go on their website and people perceive them to operate airplanes when they don't. And there's rules coming up, and by the time this podcast gets released, they may have already been put in place, that will change that. But I think you're going to see that more and more frequently, especially as people consider a platform over a more traditional brick and mortar FBO, or a business that requires significant physical assets as opposed to a technological asset. And I think you're going to find that throughout our ecosystem, whether it be a forward-facing, customer-facing system, or something that is just meant to work in between businesses. I think you're going to see that more and more frequently.
Right. So, I mean, what I'm hearing from that is that often the biggest challenge aviation startups face is the chasm between, if they're technology people that are coming to aviation, the chasm between them and the operations people, or vice versa, perhaps. And that the successful ones manage to bridge those two effectively. Is that accurate?
I think that that's probably a pretty apt response. I also believe that just as Surf Air over the years has had problems, and it certainly did when I was there as well, I think that you'll find that a lot of aviation startups have learned from each other on what's worked and what doesn't. Companies like Wheels Up, for example, they own their entire fleet. They lease them to Gama Aviation. The Gama Aviation operates them, so that Wheels Up is a membership platform. It's a membership apparatus that then they allow somebody else to operate their fleet of airplanes. So when they say we own a fleet of airplanes that are all painted in the same color, they're not incorrect. But had Surf Air made that decision, or had come to that conclusion, I think that my tenure at Surf Air probably would have been longer, and we left on very good terms. But I think that what you'll find now is that the Surf Air of 2019 is very different from the Surf Air of 2012 and 2013. And had they made that decision earlier on, they may be in a better situation now than the form that they currently take.
Right. Lots of examples of successful and failed aviation startups in the past that can be learned from. So we arrive now at YonderWest, which is your own company.
Yes.
So tell me a bit again about what you guys do. I know you mentioned it briefly earlier, and how that's going.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the way that I'm going to present YonderWest to your audience is that probably about 4 or 5 months ago, it was the fall of 2018, I kind of hit a little bit of a snag, and it was entirely self-realized. I could look somebody in the eye and they would ask me what I do, and I didn't have an elevator pitch. I didn't have a 30-second explanation of what I did. And even when I tried to make one, there would be follow-up questions because my response wasn't specific enough. So as you asked me that question today, Graham, YonderWest is a corporate aviation services company based on the central coast of California. If you had asked me what my business was 6 or 7 months ago, I would say that we were a corporate aviation scheduling and dispatch firm. But because those terms mean different things to different flight organizations, it was really tough to summarize. And I believe that that contract dispatch and scheduling is the future of our industry. And that is not just me crossing my fingers hoping that it's true. I think what you'll find is that there are more and more flight organizations out there that desperately need services like mine. A lot of times they don't know what they don't know. They don't have the resources or the need to hire a full-time scheduler. And more frequently than not, it's both. They don't have either of those capabilities or need either one of those capabilities. But for a fraction of that cost, myself and a number of my peers in the contract space can provide those services that they would normally be costing tens of thousands of dollars more per year, with additional overhead, with additional costs, with an additional headcount, all the things that come along with true full employment that a lot of them don't need. So the core of my business is still that I help small Part 91 flight departments manage and operate their airplanes. I do that from, or it doesn't matter if I'm sitting here in Miami or if I'm sitting at my home in Los Osos, California, or if I'm on the road in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Denver, it doesn't matter. However, YonderWest in and of itself has expanded. We now offer services for aircraft owner representation. So an owner of an aircraft wants to put it on an aircraft management company's certificate and fly charter. We are an intermediary to basically call aircraft management companies out when they need to be called out, so that an owner that has other businesses, this is just a side part of his or her portfolio, can distance themselves from the actual operation of the airplane and the decision makings that go along with it, so that they can focus on what's really important to them. I mean, if you hire an aircraft management firm, getting 1,500 emails a day from them about every single little thing doesn't fit. I mean, you're paying an aircraft management fee for that service. So by hiring somebody like me, I can make those determinations on behalf of an owner without any allegiance to the aircraft management company, so that we can really speak with one voice. In addition, we do aircraft acquisitions. I have a great aircraft acquisitions team in Los Angeles, and a kind of a go team that can start up and start flight operations for corporate flight departments that have either recently acquired an airplane or changed aircraft or gone through a management change. We can provide all of those services kind of in the same manner that ATBD can do it for airlines. YonderWest can do it for corporate flight departments. So we have a director of maintenance and chief pilot and a director of operations and all those people that can step in and provide services on behalf of an individual aircraft owner.
Cool. So, I mean, you mentioned briefly earlier, but one of my questions was going to be, how did you find those first clients? And was that partially via your relationship with ATBD?
Actually, it wasn't. My first set of clients actually came from the original management at Surf Air, actually. And clients that have come to me since, by and large, my marketing efforts in early 2018 fell on completely deaf ears. And it wasn't for a lack of trying, but one thing that I have learned is that nobody wants to hear how good I am for me. They want to hear a solution from somebody else. My ideal client is the one where the pilot is sitting at the bar and he says, that trip went horribly. And the pilot at the other end of the bar looks over at him and says, oh, I have a guy for you. Those are my core clients. I want to be known through reputation, good or bad, and I have a little bit of both. But ultimately, referral and recommendation is a huge part of my business. And as such, I have a set of people that have joined me in the belief that contract dispatch is the future. And as flight departments slowly realize that there is an option for them in that regard, my phone rings and I get emails, and all of a sudden things ding, and there I am. So that's kind of how my business is formulated, and it's still expanding. It's still growing. If you would ask me, when I started this business, if I'd be representing aircraft owners with management companies, I would say, no, that's not my business. And now it's my business. And as a result, as I get different projects that come in, my background lends me to say yes to a lot more consulting projects as well. So there's certainly an interest within the industry for new solutions, and I'm happy to either provide them or introduce them to a team that can. And that's really the core of what we do and how I get clients.
Yeah, referrals are so important, especially in a fairly tight industry like the private aviation industry. You mentioned you have a team sort of that you have assembled for various contract dispatch work. How did you go about sort of finding that team and recruiting them? And was that a challenge, or was that something you had experience with? Because often when people are building that first business, building a team is something that they've never done before.
Yeah. There were a number of people here in California that were very influential and helped me build my business to what it is. And an outsider could look at the relationships I have with some of my competitors and say, well, they're your competitors. You don't want to have anything to do with their business. You don't want to let them into yours. And the fact of the matter is that it's too small of a community to ignore my competitors. If there's a project that I can't undertake, or there's a project that is not as well suited for me, I have a team of people that are ultimately, yes, they are my competitors. And I can subcontract and 1099 to them, and it would be the same as if somebody came and I worked on their account personally. That being said, it doesn't happen that frequently, but I do have the opportunity to do so. The core of my team is actually people that do things that I don't. If you called me today and said, hey, I want to acquire a Global Express, I wouldn't be the guy to know anything about how to make that happen. But what I would do is I would pick up the phone and call, a great aircraft acquisitions guy down in LA, and we would run a deal, through my business on his behalf, and that's how we would be able to get it done. But yeah, the core of the core of what I do for contract scheduling, a vast majority of my clients are worked by me and exclusively me. But I have the ability to outsource to some very good friends of mine who, I'll be honest, some of them, they're better dispatchers than I am. I'm the first person to admit that. They're like, I have a good friend that has a big client in Texas, actually, and she's been working for them for years. And they have a bunch of big airplanes. They're incredibly active, and that's great. But the ideal client for me is that hawker that's sitting in the corner of a hangar in a podunk airport in Mississippi, and they have no help whatsoever. They may have a pilot that hires one of his friends when the owner needs to fly. They don't have any apparatus. They have no scheduling support. They have absolutely nothing. And the core of my business comes in and helps them either get up to speed or provides them a structure that allows them to operate safely so that they're not flying through, the skies over Montana, wondering if their Marriott reservation is confirmed. They're focused on flying the plane. And I think that that's kind of a set of core values that a lot of dispatchers can really find value in.
Right. Very good. So you're also the executive director of the NCBAA, the Northern California Business Aviation Association. And I know you're passionate about being involved in regional groups. So what are you hoping to accomplish with your role there? And why do you think involvement in regional groups is so important?
Well, a lot of it harkens back just to my original days in politics in New Hampshire. And they say that in New Hampshire, especially, all politics is local. In aviation, I think you'll find that there's the geographic borders that define us are less valid. You can get on a Gulfstream 5 and take off in Teterboro and land halfway around the world in 14 hours. Those physical boundaries don't really apply. But what is important is that when you do go home, you have a community to go home to. And Northern California for me is like nowhere else on earth. It's where I choose to make my living. It's where I choose to live. I love Northern California. I go to bed and dream about it. I wake up and look at it. It is, and the aviation community in Northern California does some of the most incredible work of any part in the country. I mean, you'll have flight departments that literally fly the globe every single day. They will have 4 or 5 airplanes, and they will be in different corners of the world, every single one of their airplanes. There won't be a single airplane sitting in Oakland. Every single one of them will be in South Africa and Australia and England and Costa Rica. They will be all over the place. And I think that that's incredible. And, community is going to be incredibly important as we go, as we all look into the future. So when organizations that come about in different parts of the country are looking for volunteers, I would, encourage your listeners to consider the opportunities of networking and volunteerism, because just because there's really cool things going on in Northern California right now, there's really awesome things happening in South Florida, and there's great things happening in Chicago and Colorado and Seattle. I get emails from the Pacific Northwest Business Aviation Association and the Pacific Rim Schedulers and Dispatchers committees up in Seattle and Portland. And every time they send me an email and say, hey, there's an event going, the first thing I do is I RSVP. I love Portland and Seattle, and the events that they do up there are incredible. And they can only do it because they have really passionate volunteers, and those volunteers wouldn't be passionate about it if all they did was like aviation. They love where they live. They love their communities, and they want to be a part of their communities. And I think that that's ultimately what all the regional groups are about. It's about finding yourself within your own community. You may be the only person that works in aviation on your block. You may be known as, oh, that pilot that lives 3 doors down from me. But at the end of the day, you're still part of that community because you're part of a flight department or a charter organization that has an engraved interest in maintaining their relationship with their community. Maybe you're the only fuel provider at the only airport within 50 miles. That's an important job. That's part of that's providing a service that ultimately benefits your entire community.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's so important. And we've had a number of guests on the show who feel similarly to you in the importance of being involved in the industry and your local communities, as well as, your communities within the industry as well. So we've covered a lot here, and, we touched on it earlier, but you've had what I would say is a fairly unorthodox path through the industry. And we talked a bit about, the non-linear path, but why do you think the unorthodox path has worked for you? Or, what might others learn from the path you've taken versus something more traditional?
Well, I would make the argument that there's nothing wrong with having a traditional path, but there's also something to be said for the idea that in having that heartache and having that tribulation, and in my case, I've been fired 4 times. Has it been tough? Yes, absolutely. But would it have gotten me to where I am today? No. And there's a value in that when bad things happen or you decide to make a change in your own profession or in your own life or whatever that decision may be, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. There's a way to look at your values, which are intimately yours. And personally, mine are shared with a lot of people in Northern California. I mean, my focus is authenticity and innovation and inclusion. I think that that's the core of my values, and that's what I bring to YonderWest every day, and that's what I brought to my former places of work every day. And as long as you have a core set of values, even as your career may go up and down, it may ebb and flow, at the end of the day, as long as you can go to bed every night and, look over at your significant other or look over at your dog or, whatever your situation may be, and think to yourself, this is the life that I want to be living, I think that there's value to that. And if you aren't, maybe taking that chance or finding that side hustle, maybe that's exactly what you need. I remember one of the times after I had involuntarily left an employer, and I went to a aviation recruiter that also helps people with their resumes. And actually, this was while I was still working somewhere. And I asked them what I should do. I was like, this is what I'm considering. What would make me more attractive as a candidate for a different job? And she gave me what is quite possible. And she's, very prominent, on the East Coast for doing this. She gave me what is quite possibly the worst advice I'd ever heard. She said, well, even if you're miserable, it's a job and you should stick at it for a couple more years. Otherwise, people will think that you just job hop all the time. And at that point, I knew that she was full of complete nonsense, that she was ultimately advocating that somebody who is miserable, as I was at that time, should continue to be miserable simply for the sake of having something on a resume. And I think that that is completely the opposite of my path. It's also not just my path, it's a lot of people's path. When it's time to make a change, you make a change. I think that in leaving Gama and going to and starting my own business in California, I think that was a pretty extreme case of that. I think that there's much more subtle ways to do it, whether it means moving to a hangar down the road or, deciding to switch paths and do sales instead of operations or do operations instead of sales. I think that there's validity to both. But at the same time, it has to be okay with you. you are the master of your destiny. And without getting too preachy about it, for a lack of a better term, there's inherent value in you doing your own thing.
Right. Not necessary to suffer in your current position for the sake of suffering. There's always other options, even within the industry.
It's a piece of paper that makes somebody else feel good. And one person told me once earlier in my career, after things had fallen apart and gone sideways, they said, the only person that cares that you got fired as much as anybody else is you.
Right.
And they were absolutely right. It was me internalizing, oh, I'm a failure. Oh, I didn't do this right. Oh, I should have done this right. Oh, what if I had done that instead?
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, all that heartache and all that agony didn't change who I was. It didn't change my perception. It didn't change how other people thought of me. It only changed how long it took me to get over the fact that I was unhappy about the situation.
Right.
Sometimes you can get success through failure, and without tooting my own horn any more than necessary, I'm kind of living proof. There's a lot of people that can have non-linear career paths, and I think that at the end of the day, you can be just as successful and get to the same conclusions as a lot of my peers who've had much more linear career paths. And it's not because I'm anything special. It's not because I've done anything differently. It's because I've taken that chance. That's all. I've shown up. Showing up is normally 90% of the battle, and I tend to show up a lot.
Well, I think that is a fantastic way to conclude most of the career talk, but I want to wrap up eventually with some quick questions. But before we get there, sometimes we talk about it at the very beginning, but we didn't this time. But in addition to the multiple titles you have right now, you've also got several hobbies, and I know I'll let you choose which ones you'd like to talk about, but they include collecting local succulents, which is part of a local conservation effort, snorkeling, volunteering at a marine mammal center, and you recently started a new wine label. So I don't know whether you want to talk about all of those, but I'll let you pick which one maybe you want to elaborate on and your interests outside of aviation.
Sure. So when it comes to locally sourcing ecology, I would once again caution your readers to say that I don't go and collect succulents locally. I raise farm raised succulents at my home.
Okay.
So I would
That's a good distinction.
I would not suggest climbing a scale cliff and stealing rare succulents from California. That is, some people do that, and it is very not cool. It is amongst the most not cool thing that you could do.
Noted.
But I have an extensive collection, mostly of Hiawatha and coastal aloes that grow very well on the central coast of California. And I am in the process of starting my own wine label. In fact, we're bottling my first custom crush of a Grenache-based rosé later this month in February. And I'm very excited about that. It's being made by an incredible winemaker of mine who's a good friend from fruit sourced on the west side of Paso Robles in the Adelaida AVA. So I'm really looking forward to that first custom crush, and hopefully having a wine that's going to be for sale. Hopefully with the 2019 or 2020 vintage. So that'll be exciting, but it is very much a work in progress. And then in addition, I recently started volunteering at the Marine Mammal Center in Morro Bay, California, which is an outside of aviation passion for ecology and wildlife. The Marine Mammal Center is, especially in our southern location in San Luis Obispo County, is a emergency triage and medical care hospital for seals, sea lions, and sea otters that are stranded and in distress, really anywhere from San Luis Obispo County in the central coast of California all the way up through Humboldt County. The patients that come to us in Morro Bay, right about now, we're going into we're going into elephant seal pupping season. So if elephant seals get separated from their parents or are malnourished or just need medical attention, and it's safe to intercede on their behalf, and with the approval of our federal permit, we go and provide medical care, and really recover a part of the ecosystem that's going to be important as we learn what nature truly holds for mankind, what the impact that humans have on the world around us and the health of the oceans. We learn that all from the animals that live in those regions. And I think that's kind of harkens back to the entire concept that everything is local. I wouldn't be rescuing sea otters if I was if I'm in Key West. So there's something to be said for that.
All great efforts, and certainly, I grew up in Nova Scotia, so I have a lot of respect for those who try to protect the oceans and those that occupy them. So I don't know whether you're much of a reader. I want to wrap up with a few quick questions here. One of the ones I typically ask is, what are 1 to 3 books that have had a large impact on you? But maybe I'll put you on the spot and get you to recommend 1 to 3 wines.
Well, that depends on what time of day it is and how much I've had so far. No, I think that right now tastes can change, and everybody has different tastes. And right now, I'm big on luscious Rhone style wines, which are expertly grown around Paso Robles. It very closely mimics the terroir in the Rhone Valley of France. So Grenache, Syrah, Mourvedre, Pic Blanc, Viognier, Roussanne, Marsanne. A lot of the Rhone grapes grow incredibly well. And more than anything else, I think it depends on the winemaker and their wine style to determine exactly what those look like. And I think that the people that make wine in California especially, but really all over the world, are incredibly talented, and they have gifts that I would never presume to ever assume that I have. And wines that are coming out of California are really, really generally beautiful creations. And I have incredible. I hold a lot of winemakers and vineyard owners in very high esteem.
All right. Well, I won't force you to pick, but I'll get a few recommendations out of you via email that we can put in the show notes.
All right. Well,
or some specific ones.
If somebody's looking for contract dispatch services, I probably have some of my own personal wine for them. How about
there you go, sweetening the pot. All right. When it comes
to books, I will tell you that Richard Branson's original version of his autobiography, Finding My Virginity, was very influential in my formative years.
Nice. Yeah, that's a great book. I enjoy all his writing. He's quite a character. When you think of the word successful, who is the first person who comes to mind and why?
I'd probably say my father. My dad is currently retired in Manchester, New Hampshire, and he came from a very kind of tomboy, sportsy kind of background in coastal Maine, and he became a well-loved civil servant in Manchester. He retired as the chief of Parks and Recreation, and his just his background and the way that he looks at life and the way that people perceive him just breathes success to me. It didn't matter that he wasn't titan of industry, and it didn't matter that, he could tell you the different, areas of a wastewater treatment plant. What matters is how people perceived him. And the Union Leader, which is our hometown newspaper in Manchester, New Hampshire, upon the news that he was retiring, described him as I believe it was the ever cheerful, bushy bearded, smiling chief of Parks and Rec. And I think that ultimately, at the end of the day, I think that's how I'd like to be known too. I just want to be that smiley, happy guy that people like and admire, and their background and their pedigree is less relevant as just making people smile.
Yeah, I think that's great. What is the worst advice you hear being dispensed in the business aviation world?
Hey, let's double the price and sell it. I think that I've had a number of people come to me in the past year or so that I'm mentoring a little bit, and they've come to me with a couple of different business ideas. Hey, I want to start a brokerage business for charters. I want to start doing a different sales platform for fuel. I want to do this. I want to do that. I think that there's a lot of validity to a lot of those ideas. But ultimately, I think part of the problem is that monetizing those businesses is very, very difficult. And I've learned that the hard way with YonderWest, where, the original core idea, I've not been able to monetize in the way that I wanted to. And as such, I've diversified out. And I think that probably one of the worst set of advice is that, if it's something that already exists, you can just resell it. And I'm not a sales guy, so you can't ask me to do that. To other people, they're absolutely salespeople, and they deserve a lot of respect because they have a lot of skills that I don't. But I would probably caution your listeners that just having a sales mentality oftentimes isn't enough.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much, Neil. Really enjoyed this. What is the best way for people to reach you online, or however you'd like them to?
So the easiest thing to do is to send me an email, and my email is Neil, Neil, at YonderWest.Aero. That's YonderWest.Aero. And also you can follow my personal adventures on Instagram, and my handle is YonderWest.
Perfect. And we'll link those in the show notes. Thank you so much for taking the time, Neil.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I hope you have a wonderful time in Los Angeles, and you make it home safe, Graham.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Just a reminder, you can find show notes, links to everything we talked about, and more at leansystems.co/podcast. And I would encourage you to sign up for our email list to make sure you get notified about new blog posts and podcasts. See you next time.